Good afternoon, everyone. Blaise Mishtal, JINSA's Vice President for Policy. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's been 2 busy days here in Washington with the visit of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. We've had F-35 flyovers over the White House, street closures, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where MBS is staying, is a virtual fortress. It's been an exciting 2 days, and this follows after having Ahmed al-Shara, the president of Syria, here last week. So we've had a veritable murderer's row of visitors to the White House in the last week. But here to talk about it, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues, John Hanna, the Charles Wax Senior Fellow here at JINSA, and Jonathan Ruhe, fellow at JINSA on American Strategy. Jonathan, thanks for being with us.
Great. Thanks for having us, please.
Thank you.
Uh, John, maybe I could start with you just to give us a bit of a background of how we got here, at least since the last time MBS visited the White House, I believe in 2018. What has been the course of the U.S.-Saudi relationship for the last 7 years?
Yeah, well, of course, shortly after that 2018 visit, which lasted for weeks, in which MBS really did a complete tour of the United States, not only at the White House. He had, of course, just become Crown Prince shortly after arriving in the United States, or shortly before arriving in the United States in 2018. Hadn't been in the job a long time. And there was obviously a very steep learning curve. He undertook a number of very aggressive actions in foreign affairs, whether it being, launching the war in Yemen, doing a number of things toward Lebanon, locking up people inside the kingdom for alleged corruption, which all eventually, of course, culminated in the murder of this U.S.-based Saudi columnist, Jamal Khashoggi, in October of 2018, which, of course, a hit team that apparently was dispatched by the royal court in Riyadh had dispatched to Istanbul, allegedly to kidnap Khashoggi back to the kingdom, to set him straight for the criticisms in some of his columns he'd been making of MBS, but they ended up obviously killing him and disposing of his body in a particularly grisly way, where we still don't know where that body is. That, of course, there was a huge backlash against that in the United States. Trump, to his credit, I guess you got to say, stood up for the relationship, refused to break it at a time when a lot of very important and influential, both Republican and Democratic senators were demanding that there be some kind of fundamental breach in this longtime strategic relationship that had had, of course, its ups and downs. Saudi human rights have never been a high point for that regime, and yet one president after another since 1945 has believed that the relationship, despite its less attractive parts of it regarding Saudi values and their approach to human rights, and obviously the spread of Wahhabi religious jihadism around the globe to Muslim communities, that it was worth still investing in, that the United States gained real benefits from that. And Trump insisted on maintaining the relationship through a very rough time through the end of his tenure. I think he had some hopes that when he did the Abraham Accords, he might at the last minute be able to bring MBS in. There was a little bit of noise around that, but in the end, they didn't have the bandwidth. It didn't happen. And of course, then we had the Biden administration, which, at least initially, for the first 1 or 2 years, appeared to act upon that instinct that Khashoggi was everything. It now defined the relationship. MBS was and Saudis were pariahs, didn't share any of our values. Now that American energy, thanks to shale oil, was rapidly rising, we didn't need the Saudis anymore, and therefore could really dispense with that relationship. And there was a period of time in 2021 and 2020 where you could have thought that the most important enemy or adversary of the United States in the Middle East was in fact the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. Lo and behold, we had the Ukraine war, real concerns about what was going to happen to destabilize oil markets, the need for the Saudis to really get back in and be friendly and open to U.S. In treaties regarding oil and other things, and President Biden swallows hard and changes course in a pretty fundamental way, travels to Saudi Arabia in the summer of 2022, does his famous fist bump, and tries to put the kind of awful period of the first 2 years of his administration behind him and tries to recover in terms of American credibility with Saudi Arabia. There are still some bumpy patches about oil markets, but by 2023, 2024, despite the Gaza war and leading up to the Gaza war, and then even after, there's a serious discussion in which the United States is trying to bring Saudi Arabia, Israel together in a normalization deal, being willing to consider mutual defense pacts with the Saudis as part of that. Very advanced civil nuclear cooperation with the Saudis, including some consideration of providing some kind of indigenous capability to enrich uranium on Saudi soil in some form or another, which would have been a real step beyond traditional U.S. nonproliferation policy, but it was under active consideration. And of course, things regarding AI and new kinds of defense a relationship in which the Saudis would get better access to American defense materials that they desperately wanted. So the real pivot, I think, and change occurs when Biden has to swallow hard, and even the Democrats have to acknowledge this is an absolutely pivotal relationship for America's strategic interests, not only in the Middle East, but even vis-a-vis theaters like Russia and China, potentially. And therefore, we need the Saudis on our side, warts and all of the Saudi regime. And I think when you get Trump back in, you just get that on steroids because of all the personal factors surrounding it, the personal business interests, Trump's love of Saudi Arabia and the pomp and circumstance and the way they fet Trump and make Trump feel when he shows up there on his first two, both in his first term, the second term. His first visit is made not to traditional allies in Canada or Europe, or Mexico, but in fact is made to Saudi Arabia. He's treated like a king himself and loves it and has this real attachment. And of course, the dollar signs that the Saudis are able to deliver on the things that Trump, this transactional president, cares most about. Not just the dollar signs, but the ability to announce hundreds of billions, $1 trillion worth of deals, even in all kinds of different sectors, investments in the United States that he can claim as great victories and of benefit to the United States. All of that you saw on display yesterday in that Oval Office meeting where Trump is defending MBS, even more than MBS. He's more defensive about the Khashoggi murder, about 9/11, about lauding MBS as this great leader and personal friend, and the Saudis as an ally, the equivalent of Israel, deserving the most advanced American defense equipment, and then obviously MBS, despite not being a head of state, being treated as the de facto head of state in terms of an over-the-top White House lawn ceremony, and as you said, the flyovers of F-35s and F-15s and the brass bands, and then the black tie dinner in which everybody who's anybody in the world of high tech and other major business sectors and political leaders up on the Hill attend and pay tribute to the next Saudi king.
So, John, you laid out sort of the circuitous route that the U.S. has taken from 2018 to now with regards to Saudi Arabia, maybe the cyclical path we've ended up where we began. What about MBS? Has he changed at all? Has Saudi Arabia changed at all in that time? Is he still sort of the brash young man that he was 7 years ago?
Yeah, no, in my opinion, no. No, the guy clearly learned lessons. I don't know if he overlearned the lessons because he's become, and we can discuss it, a pretty cautious leader in national security and foreign affairs, given the way, the posture he had toward the Iran threat, for instance, 6, 7, 8 years ago, the way he talked about them as a Hitler-like regime that essentially needed to be confronted, combated, and probably overthrown and thrown on the dustbin of history. That's the same guy who in 2023 used China to mediate some kind of détente and accommodation with the Iranians, and who you have to say was not particularly enthusiastic about the 12-day war. Enthusiastic, no doubt about the outcome of it, but unbelievably nervous. And I bet if you had asked him on June the 12th or 11th, a couple of days before the war, do you want Israel to attack and start this war or not? Right on your doorstep, he probably would have said no. I prefer not. Let's let the negotiations between Witkoff and the Iranians continue to see what they can do. But I want to keep this stuff, any kind of conflict, away from me because I've been burnt before by being too aggressive. I need to just keep this stuff, manage it away from my borders right now, focus on my number one mission, which is this truly incredible program of economic, cultural, religious transformation that he's undertaken in the kingdom. It's probably the most important transformation or program of reform in a major state anywhere in the world. And certainly the last, I don't know, 30, 50 years, I guess maybe you point to China sometime in the late 20th century as something comparable. And to Ataturk, after World War One, a century ago. So all that is incredibly important. It deserves more attention than it gets. I think from American leaders, we ought to be talking about what's happening internally in Saudi more and the benefits that could accrue both to the kingdom, the Middle East, and to the United States from that. But yes, Blaze, the basic answer to your question, this is a man who's learned lessons. He's a more mature and confident leader. You saw that on display in the Oval Office yesterday, his command of the English language, which he obviously didn't have 7 years ago. Yeah, this is a different leader who's I would say, a lot more cautious on being too confrontational or aggressive in foreign affairs, which has some drawbacks to it, but one who's really laser focused on the success of this Vision 2030, his own personal success, his succession to be the king of Saudi Arabia for perhaps the next 40 or 50 years, and not only to become the dominant Arab and Muslim state in the world, but probably a top 10 player on the global scene, in toto.
So that's sort of how we got to the meeting yesterday. Uh, John talked a little bit about the pomp and circumstance of the meeting, but Jonathan, maybe you could talk a little bit about the substance. What was actually done yesterday? What business was done? What was agreed to between President Trump and Crown Prince bin Salman?
Yeah, thanks, Blaze. So yeah, there's been no shortage of sort of deals that have been announced, sort of broad, sweeping ambitions that have been put on paper. Some of which builds on Trump's visit to Riyadh in May that John mentioned, in which the president sort of announced sort of a transformational vision for the region, and to people like us who've worked in Middle East security issues for a long time, maybe something we're not always used to hearing, which is a sort of aggressively optimistic view of what the region can become. We saw Trump reiterate a lot of those themes in his speeches in Israel and Egypt after the Gaza ceasefire last month. So, sort of as a sort of organizing framework to understand, I think a lot of what we've seen announced since MBS landed sort of built around several themes that would, as John said, sort of double down on the bilateral partnership, focused specifically in some ways on strengthening U.S. Saudi defense cooperation, making it more formalized. Obviously, there's been sort of no shortage of political speed bumps along the way in terms of things like U.S. arms transfers to the kingdom, uh, also security guarantees, things like that. Another sort of overlapping theme that we've heard about, especially going back when there were talks under President Biden on some of these issues I'm going to discuss, is as a price or a trade-off for the United States, uh, picking Saudi Arabia as a partner, doing all these things, making these commitments, having the Saudis in various ways, essentially, for lack of a better term, choose sides in the global strategic competition with China, finding ways to bring them more squarely on board with the United States as a partner, and then also, as I mentioned, this sort of Trump's vision of how the Middle East can be an area for opportunity and building peace through prosperity. So obviously, a core issue has been the U.S. Decision to sell F-35 combat aircraft to the Saudis. It's not the first Arab partner where we've at least made an initial agreement that was followed the Abraham Accords in 2020, the agreement to sell them to the United Arab Emirates, which fell through for any number of reasons. But now there's as Saudi Arabia, which already has on paper and in terms of, if you look at their order of battle, a very impressive set of armed forces, including frankly, a world-class Air Force, one that's among the largest, certainly in the Middle East. Adding the F-35, being the only country other than Israel in the region to have a fifth generation aircraft like this would certainly be a game changer. And obviously, it's agreeing to sell those aircraft and then getting to the point where Saudi Arabia actually takes control of them is a whole different side discussion, a rabbit hole that could perhaps merit its own webinar. Another one is, as John mentioned, is an agreement on a civil nuclear cooperation deal, and then also designating Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally. It's a formal designation. Several other countries in the Middle East, like Qatar and Israel, have this designation. It's essentially, from what I understand, in the context of Saudi Arabia, major non-NATO ally status. It confers a lot of things. This is as much a political signal as a substantive military cooperation agreement. But among other things, it expedites certain U.S. arms transfers to countries that are so designated, which I read as sort of one of the main reasons it's interesting to the Saudis. One thing that I think has fallen a little bit between the cracks, but is potentially a great area of vital importance to the United States, is an agreement on critical minerals supply chains all around DC. We constantly hear terms about China's control of rare earth elements. That's a subset of this larger issue of critical minerals, basic substances that are used in everything from electric vehicle batteries to critical components of advanced weapon systems. As we've seen in recent years, China is more than happy to exercise and leverage its near monopoly control of a lot of these resources. Saudi Arabia has signaled its intent in the past to helps to diversify these supply chains around the world. This, I think, is something that certainly has a very high ceiling for cooperation directly relevant to the United States in a way that maybe not a lot of people appreciate off the bat. As John mentioned, there's the black tie galas and these, the fancy dinners where Saudi Arabia announces, I think they announced $1 trillion is the aim for investment in U.S. infrastructure technology. That builds directly on things that were announced during Trump's visit to Riyadh in May. And then, as John mentioned, also sort of an MOU, a memorandum of understanding on cooperation on AI technology, things like that. As Saudi Arabia, as part of its Vision 2030, tries to become a world leader in information technology. So that's one more initiative going forward. So, I think you've seen this large sort of grab bag of things that reflect, as John said, the potential to really what the U.S.-Saudi partnership could really bring to supporting U.S. interests. But again, as I think what we've seen so far, these are very ambitious signals of intent with the substance to be filled in as we go forward.
So that's what was agreed to yesterday. What's missing? What's been discussed in U.S.-Saudi relations that we didn't see yesterday?
So I think we certainly saw Trump make reference to the elephant in the room, at least before MBS arrived, which is the issue of Israel-Saudi normalization, advancing the Abraham Accords, and project I worked on with John 4 years ago. As JINSA argued, for all the amazing benefits and sort of diplomatic signals that the original Abraham Accords sent, having Saudi Arabia join that would be sort of a complete game changer beyond what we've already seen. It's the custodian of the two holy places of Islam. It's a very influential and important country, not only in the Arab world, but the larger Muslim world. And Saudi Arabia joining would give an imprimatur a legitimacy that could enable a flood of other countries to recognize Israel on a truly not just a regional, but potentially a more global scale. I haven't seen in the readouts anything that hinges or links any of what I just the laundry list I just gave that links that to this issue of normalization. Certainly, the U.S. Israel-Saudi normalization also occurs in the context of the Gaza ceasefire and the efforts to get a more lasting peace there, and all the political discussions that entails. I think also one thing that we've heard a lot about in the past is, a more formal U.S. security guarantee or mutual defense treaty with the Saudis. We saw Trump give Qatar a defense guarantee, which is not mutual, which is essentially a U.S. security umbrella extended to Qatar. The idea that if Qatar gets that, a partner that's like Saudi Arabia would be in line for something much more substantive than that. Still waiting to see more details on that as well.
Yeah, so John, I guess let me go back to you, and particularly on this issue of a security guarantee. Uh, you know, do you think MBS is happy with what he got? Did he get everything he could have expected? Was he hoping to get this Qatar-like executive order on a security guarantee, or was that missing? Or do you think major NATO non-ally or major non-NATO ally status is good enough for the Saudis?
Listen, I was or JINSA was in the kingdom in the fall of 2022, had a particularly bad patch in the relationship in which MBS was. We met with them and extremely willing to talk about normalization, but also entirely in the context of what he would need in terms of the U.S.-Saudi bilateral relationship, real strategic improvements in order to mitigate the risks that he understood himself to be taking by normalizing with Israel at a point in time when there were still significant portions of his population. Remember, this is before October 7th, that might even oppose violently a turn toward Israel, as well as whatever fire would come at him from Iran and Iranian propaganda channels and ISIS and others. Getting at that point in time, he said nothing less than a Japan-like, Article 5-like mutual defense treaty with the United States, which would have bipartisan support in the United States Congress, a supermajority of 67 senators voting in favor, that would become a permanent feature of the American national security landscape, that would then insulate Saudi Arabia from one of the things it hates most, which is this sense that from one American administration to another, you have these dramatic fluctuations in policy towards Saudi Arabia that the kingdom simply cannot rely on in terms of its defense doctrine in a very difficult neighborhood. That was a position that he seemed to have throughout the Biden administration as well. I need a Japan-like, Article 5-like guarantee from the United States that's approved by the United States Senate and lasting. And instead, what he's gotten, it appears so far anyway, in the first place, Qatar beat him to it. Whatever it was, Qatar beat him to it by getting an executive order that gave this unique and unprecedented, explicit American commitment that an attack on Qatar is going to be treated as a very serious issue for American national security, that we'd be willing to think and contemplate using military force to combat. The fact that Qatar got that, this small, insignificant tribe that's a pimple on the Arabian Peninsula that has a fraction of the influence of the power that Saudi has both regionally and globally, much less this 8-decade storied relationship going back to the FDR Abdulaziz meetings on the USS Quincy in 1945. Qatar's got none of that, and yet they're the ones who suddenly rise to this first tier of American security commitments in the Middle East. I think for MBS, having to play catch up to that, I would imagine would have been hugely embarrassing, having to climb down from his insistence on a mutual defense treaty, that would have been lasting and permanent to get something with, okay, a president he likes, but a president who's pretty unpredictable, kind of mercurial, likely only to be around the next 3 years, who in 2019, when the Saudis sort of had a near-death experience with the Iranian attack on their most important oil infrastructures, the most important infrastructure in their entire economy, Trump basically said, too bad. You got a lot of hardware we sold you. Defend yourself. We're not going to come to your assistance. So the best you can get is a temporary, maybe it doesn't appear they've gotten an executive order even yet. We don't know what's in this U.S. Saudi strategic defense agreement that they've apparently signed up for. We've got to see what that language, what the security commitment looks like in there. But then they also got major non-NATO ally status, right? I mean, something Israel and Egypt had 40 years ago, Jordan had 30 years ago, Kuwait and Morocco had 20 years ago, Tunisia 10 years ago, and the Qataris 3 years ago. So what, big whoop. Okay, you're following in their footsteps. What took you so long, Saudi Arabia? But they got that. And I think it's because, as bad as it is to be seen following these guys and to be climbing down from the defense treaty, you can't get the defense treaty because it's wrapped up in normalization, and normalization is too difficult for you at this point, too difficult for the Israelis. But you certainly don't want to be relegated to some second tier status in the pantheon of American security commitments in the Middle East. So you got to get something that somehow begins to reassert Saudi Arabia's preeminent role. You got to get something that's at least as good as what the Qataris got, if not some more. And I think the thing they get, at least on paper, is a commitment in principle to sell them the F-35. And if it's consummated several years hence, they're going to be the only Arab state with the F-35 in their order of battle. And that again begins to set the kingdom apart, as of course did Trump's, treatment of MBS as a virtual head of state and the next king of Saudi Arabia over the last 2 years, which it's hard to remember the last actual head of state, allied or otherwise, that got the kind of treatment that MBS got yesterday, much less the kid glove kind of treatment and defense he got on some pretty indefensible things that have happened by the president of the United States.
So on that point about the F-35, Jonathan, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but maybe you could delve into it a little more, both sort of the process, sort of when would Saudi get the F-35? Is it a done deal? Are there obstacles in the way still? And what would the effect of that be on the balance of power in the region?
Yeah. So the short answer is it would be a long process for any number of reasons. One is, there's a long list of buyers for the F-35, especially in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Plenty of European countries have already put in bids to acquire the F-35. That's in addition to the countries that were already in line to take order of these, including Israel ordering a third squadron of the F-35. Currently, they have 50. That would bring them up to 75. So partly it's just a function of the United States' ability to crank these out, and the place in line that the Saudis would try to be holding. Another one is political set of considerations. Something that's potentially game changing is the F-35. It's one of the best export capabilities the U.S. defense industry has available. As we've seen in the past, Saudi's acquisition or attempts to acquire U.S. offensive weapon systems in the past comes into any number of holdups, some of which can be in the executive branch about export control restrictions. Although Saudi Arabia's major non-NATO ally status is meant to obviate some of that. Also, Congress has a say, and certainly they've exercised that in the past to hold up or complicate the arms transfers. That's all a long way of saying we're talking likely years. I've seen estimates it could be in the ballpark of 5 years. Certainly it's for other countries that are still waiting to acquire F-35s that have made big buys. It's been an even longer waiting time than that. And I think also there's the other political issue, which is Israel's qualitative military edge. Now we've seen and heard plenty in the past few days. Israel sort of officially opposed the idea of transferring the F-35s to Saudi Arabia because of, again, this thing that's written into U.S. law. The United States must consider Israel's qualitative military edge when considering arms sales to other countries in the region. I forget the exact wording, but basically Israel's QME, as it's called, is its ability to defeat threats to its existence at reasonable cost to itself from its neighbors or a coalition of its neighbors. That can be an elastic and somewhat subjective definition, but things like selling fifth generation aircraft to a country that almost borders Israel is certainly one of the things that sort of sharpens that definition. But that's a U.S. legal requirement that be put into consideration. Trump, as we've seen, was willing to look past Israel's concerns and in agreeing to transfer the F-35, but this QME issue is certainly something that could continue to come up given how long it's likely going to take for Saudi Arabia to take control of these aircraft if it ever does.
Yeah, and I guess, Jonathan, one more question for you. Is an F-35 an F-35 an F-35? Are sort of all of these aircraft made equal? Does that mean that Saudi Arabia is getting the exact same aircraft and systems that Israel has?
So from what I've seen, Saudi Arabia is asking for the F-35A, which is, I forget the production runs, but it's basically the standard F-35 airframe. It's meant for typical use by an air force as opposed to some of the other variants which are used for naval purposes. It's similar to Israel, but Israel has a more bespoke model called the F-35I, in which they install their own avionics and various other capabilities. I think Saudi Arabia, look, the F-35, one of the things that makes it so great, and I would commend other recent JINSA products about events related to the 12-day war and Israeli operations to learn more about the F-35, because Israel has really been on the cutting edge of deploying and learning all about what this aircraft can do. The F-35, it's called a combat aircraft. We call it a fighter jet shorthand, but really it's sort of a multi-mission enabler. I don't want to use too much doublespeak, but basically the F-35 is a platform that enables all the other aircraft and systems that a country has to work together more effectively. So it would be part of this larger piece. It's a capability by itself, but it's part of this larger piece to be considered with Saudi Arabia's vast fleet of very advanced F-15 combat aircraft they bought from us. Also, they have a bunch of European-made fighter jets and also air defenses, electronic warfare capabilities, things like that, advanced airborne early warning, this whole suite of very advanced Air Force and air defense capabilities that if the F-35 is used correctly and used well, is what we call a force multiplier. So I would encourage people to think of the F-35 not just as another stealthier version of an F-15 or F-16 that can drop more bombs. Its importance goes way beyond that.
So, John, I guess let me ask you bluntly, what is the future of normalization now? Did the Saudis get the F-35 and major non-NATO ally status, and that's good enough, and we've sort of given up all of our leverage, and there's no more, sort of they got the milk for free. There's no reason to buy the cow. Or is this idea of the defense treaty hanging out there still enough leverage to maybe uh, for the United States to convince MBS to keep going down that path and keep working towards peace with Israel?
Yeah, I think normalization is not dead. I mean, the fact that MBS, okay, he talked about it in terms of, we want to normalize, we want to have peace with Israel, but it's got to be in the context of a solution to the Palestinian issue, is still not nothing for a Saudi monarch country that rejected the existence of a Jewish state for decades and decades, and still because of, let's face it, domestic hostility to Israel, especially in the wake of the Gaza war, still refuses to normalize its relationship with it so it can actually get something done with Israel on the Palestinian issue. It's demanding that Israel first takes steps. But Trump talked about it. I think Trump badly wants it. I do think he sees it as really legacy capping for him, the key probably to a Nobel Peace Prize. And something that if he got Saudi-Israeli normalization, for all the reasons that Jonathan mentioned, the knock-on effects of making peace between the world's only Jewish state and the world's most powerful and influential Arab and Islamic state is going to resound far and wide, not just regionally, but globally. It'll be a very, very big deal. So I think Trump probably understands that. It might, together with the Abraham Accords, make him the most consequential president ever diplomatically in terms of the Middle East and the way it transforms the landscape in ways favorable to American national interests. So I think he wants it. I think MBS still sees the value in being able to have peaceful relations with, the region's most powerful military and economic force, so close to his borders, could be enormously helpful to him. But obviously we're stuck around this obstacle of what to do about the Palestinian issue. MBS feels in the wake of the Gaza war and in light of his domestic and regional and global situation as the protector of the two holy mosques, his role in global Islam as a leader, that he's got to deliver something significant now for the Palestinians. And it's a price that at least this Israeli government and probably the Israeli public feels they can't do anything about. Now, I think, as I said, I think, if you gave a truth serum to MBS, what he's getting on the security dimensions is not what he would have really liked from the United States. If he thought he could have de-linked normalization from a mutual defense pact, he would have wanted to go for a mutual defense pact. I think right now, as I said, he's playing catch up. He's getting what he can right now in order to reassert the Saudi role with the United States. But I think he knows he can play for more later once normalization might be riper, depending on what happens in and around the next Israeli election next year sometime. And I think, on frankly on F, so I think the MDT, the Mutual Defense Treaty, remains real leverage with him. That would truly set him apart. And in the context of normalization, I think it's still a possibility. So I still think there's that card for the United States to play. And I do think the time frame of F-35s, easy for Trump to say, I'm willing to sell them. They're a great ally, wonderful guys, knowing that this is years down the road before these things get produced, before Saudi pilots get trained, before whatever Congress does what it's going to do. It's a long way away. And in that time, it wouldn't surprise me if Trump or people around Trump are thinking to themselves, on the one hand, we got to balance, we can't embarrass, we got to give something, we got to boost this important strategic bilateral relationship with the Saudis. Yet we also have to keep in mind our interest that we need some leverage on normalization. And so down the road, as this begins to play out, as hopefully the Gaza ceasefire moves forward, we get to a better place with the Palestinian issue, and Israel finds its way to be able to come up with some formula that satisfies MBS. I'm sure there are other things Trump could do to incentivize MBS outside of the Palestinian issue, whether it's in terms of the AI chips, in terms of U.S. investments, in terms of other defensive systems we're prepared to provide. But I do think even the F-35, even though it's been agreed in theory, long way to delivery and Saudi pilots flying these near Israel's border, that there's still a lot of negotiations and things that can happen that will allow for this, 2, 3 years down the road, especially with some distance away from the Gaza war, once the emotions begin to cool, assuming we don't have a restart of the war and the kind of carnage that Saudis were seeing on their screens over the last 2 years. I think that distance and that time also is a salve that will allow MBS a little greater flexibility. So I'm still hopeful that there are important levers out there that the Saudis value, that the United States can still pull, even as it tries to advance elements of the Saudi US bilateral relationship, apparently delinked from normalization.
Yeah, I think it's probably important to remember that as part of the Abraham Accords more than 5 years ago now, the UAE was promised F-35s, and there's been no movement on that effectively so far. So
Yeah.
that is potentially quite a way in the distance yet.
And
Let
Blaze, it,
me
it is just worth mentioning. I think Jonathan mentioned it briefly, but it's almost as deeply worrying to the extent you could have the impression over the last couple of days that the president could give a rat's you know what about QME. And in his mind, these are equal allies. They should both get the same kind of weaponry. Um, as worrying as that would be, and I don't think that's true because they're statutorily bound to do this, and I do think Trump values Israel's security. I'm not sure Israel, knowing that this deal has been in the works for several weeks and months, I'm not sure Israel ever made the best case and a timely case for why and how problematic this would be. I don't know that for a fact. That is my impression. They've kind of lost the thread on F-35 over the last several months, didn't make their best case.
certainly compared to how much we've heard from Israel about
On Turkey,
concerns about Turkey and the
absolutely,
F-35s. Yeah.
absolutely. I think they had their eye on that ball and less on the Saudi ball, and now they're trying to sort of furiously catch up, and it looks like they've taken a hit here, frankly, and weren't able to affect the president's decision despite this close relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Trump. The other thing, almost equally as worrisome, I'm not hearing anything about the China thing. I didn't hear anything about what we got from Qatar in terms of any of its really bad behavior, much less on China in terms of permanently solving that problem in exchange for a very unique and unprecedented American bilateral security commitment, or at least a presidential security commitment to them. And we're not hearing anything about Saudis. And obviously, in the context of F-35s or anything having to do with U.S. interests, as deep as the Saudis are into certain elements of Chinese high tech, obviously the economic relationship, but it's mostly the high tech. It's Saudi personnel and scientists and engineers inside of the kingdom. It's Saudi Chinese weapon systems, drones, and missiles and other fairly advanced capabilities. It's Aramco and other Saudi entities that are deeply reliant on Chinese AI and the DeepSeek learning model. I don't hear anything about that. I thought I heard the president, to the extent he talked about China, said we got a great relationship with China. It's not an issue. It's not a problem. Being very dismissive about it. But we know people, as you said, in the UAE case, this might have been the straw that broke the camel's back. Their inability to get the UAE in a timely way to back off from its interactions with China, particularly in the high tech space, that sank the F-35 deal with the UAE. I'm not hearing anything about that basic commitment of the Saudis that no more hedging with China, much less the Russians on Ukraine. We got to know that if the balloon of war goes up in Taiwan, and China remains as dependent as it is on major oil exports from Saudi, you don't need to tell the Chinese this, but America needs to know that you're going to fall on the American side of that equation. And I don't have any confidence in that regard yet. And I just think it's the kind of thing, obviously, that the Congress if not the American public, are going to have to pound away at, in addition to the QME issues and normalization over the next several, weeks, months, years, whatever it is.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. I'm looking here at the White House language on their official statements of all these deals that were announced. They don't mention China. They talk more about these agreements will, protect U.S. technology from foreign influence and make Saudi Arabia, make America Saudi Arabia's partner of choice. So that's full stop.
It's a
Yeah.
little too
So
loose for me.
yeah. So, first of all, let me invite the audience to submit any questions they want to ask John or Jonathan using the Q&A function in Zoom. If you type out your question, I can pose it, read it to John and Jonathan. But in the meantime, John, maybe picking up on your last thread there, um, what did the United States get out of this? If President Trump wants a Nobel Peace Prize for expanding the Abraham Accords and getting Saudi-Israeli normalization, he didn't get that. He didn't get something very clear on China. As you just said, were there any promises that Saudi Arabia would maybe change some of this worrisome also foreign policy behavior where they went to China and made amends with Iran and in the past couple of weeks they've signed a defense treaty with Pakistan. Have they committed in any way to sort of fully come back to the U.S. orbit, or what else? Is it just the $1 trillion investment? What's the United States getting out of all of this?
It's a good question, Blaze. Listen, there's obviously a lot we don't know. Very frustrating. You get these grand announcements and very broad statements about various areas that have been agreed to. We don't have any of the text. We don't have any of the understanding. We don't have any insight into the negotiating history and what kind of quiet promises were made and commitments were made by each side. So I think we do have to be careful. I think, the one thing I think you do get a sense of is that MBS on sort of core questions about Saudi security, um, and things like AI, the high-tech future, that I do think they have made a decision that America remains their partner of choice. America is a strategic partner for them. Everybody else that they mess around with, that's much more transactional and tactical for them. It's a part of playing power politics on the global stage. They've got, obviously a 360-degree foreign policy. They deal with Russia, they deal with China, they deal with India, they deal with Pakistan, they deal with Europe, they deal with the United States. And, what's the big deal? I do think we ought to make a big deal about it. I hope we are. I don't, we can't begrudge the Saudis being a major player on the world stage and being obviously the world's main exporter of oil and having relationships with these other great powers that are mutually beneficial. But again, we got to have fair confidence that on issues that are obviously crucial and vital to American national security, like making sure Russia doesn't win in Ukraine by the Saudis buying up cheap Russian oil so they can sell it for a profit, or engaging Chinese high tech in a major way that's threatening to us and threatens our technology to them. And in the event of a war in Taiwan, we'd want to know firmly that the Saudis are not going to hedge like they did in Ukraine, but they're going to be on America's side using all the assets at their command that they have. So you hope some of that happen. We don't have evidence of it. The one thing we have evidence of is $1 trillion announcement of Saudi investments and commitments economically to the United States, which plays obviously into every, Trump wheelhouse there is. The announcements are almost more important than the actual execution of these deals. How many years, decades, if ever, are these deals going to be consummated? That doesn't matter to Trump. It's something he can claim right now. It's now 20, $21 trillion of investment that are going to be pouring into America, making us great, making us strong. Listen, unfortunately, I have to say it, the personal business elements of this are seedy and corrupt and unknowable, although we know some, thanks to some reporting that's been done, something pretty unprecedented and at a scope and scale that's just unimaginable. How much of that $1 trillion is being wrapped up in various deals and investments with interested parties and players who have an ability to affect U.S. national security policy. I hate to say that, but it's hard, if you're objectively looking at the situation over the last year, not to introduce that into the equation. So, but outside of that $1 trillion announcement, that God knows how it's ever going to be executed, how the Saudis are going to make good on that, given they've got about $1 trillion GDP and 80% of their public investment fund is committed to local investments in Saudi Arabia. So it's going to be a very, very heavy lift to do it in any reasonable time frame. But it's a fantastic announcement for Trump to make and to make to his base on how he's making good on his commitments and his America First foreign policy. But frankly, outside of that, and even that is pretty flimsy, I'm not sure what we got for giving, at least on paper, the Crown Prince a lot of what he wanted in terms of AI in particular, and turning Saudi Arabia into a AI superpower, certainly the most important one in the Middle East, thanks to American technology and American companies flooding into the kingdom to build out data centers on cheap oil and cheap land, which I think was probably his first priority because it is the key to his most important goal, which is the success of Vision 2030 and securing his reign for the next several decades. But then even also on things like F-30, F-35, that was an important card for America to play, even if it's somehow vaguely linked to normalization in the distant future. For the president to play that without thinking, how do I shape all of these goodies for the Saudis, not just in terms of some futuristic commitment to the American economy, but to really radically transforming the security architecture of this vital region of the world by bringing our most important ally, Israel, together with our most powerful and influential Arab and Muslim partner, bringing them together, anchoring them in some kind of mutual defense agreements, and building out from there a genuine regional architecture that will carry the burden for securing regional peace and security and stability, take a lot under an American umbrella, an American organization, and American enablers, but allowing America also to do what it needs to do in transferring at least some of its intentions and resources to our other global responsibilities, in particular, obviously, the Asia Pacific.
So, with the few remaining minutes that we have, John, maybe quickly, one of the questions we got pertaining to the future of normalization is what impact Israel's elections next year might have on prospects for getting a deal.
Yeah, listen, I mean, the solution to this right now is the easiest solution, but also the hardest one because of Israeli politics and the post-October 7th environment, is for an Israeli government to say, yes, our vision somewhere many years hence is that if there is a Palestinian entity prepared to accept very constrained sovereignty, to live in peace with Israel, to be demilitarized, to educate its children, to live in peace with the Jewish state, to not be able to make any treaties with Iran or any other hostile actors, that's friendly to the key buffer state of Jordan, that if that happens, we can accept some kind of limited, sovereign, independent Palestinian entity next door to us with all those appropriate constraints and changes and reforms in the way they do business, knowing that it's years in the future, if ever. But that kind of commitment by an Israeli government, which they've done more or less in the past, I think would probably go a long way to cutting this Gordian knot and allowing MBS to really begin to make a major push and for America to make a major new push toward this, big strategic deal of normalization in the region. Not to say that the creation of some kind of even constrained sovereign Palestinian entity in the West Bank and Gaza wouldn't be a big strategic deal and risky and dangerous. But that would be the course that you get some kind of Israeli government that's prepared to do that. Can Bibi do it? I don't know. 2009, he basically accepted a constrained Palestinian sovereign state in the West Bank and Gaza. Very, very heavy constraints on everything it could do, particularly militarily. Had to fight terror, couldn't control its own airspace. Borders largely controlled in conjunction with Israel, both east and west. But yes, they'd have passports, they'd have a flag, they'd have a toehold in some neighborhood just outside of East Jerusalem. So Bibi's been there before. He obviously has reversed dramatically since then because of October 7th. Could he get there again? I don't know. In the context of a Saudi deal, maybe a pardon for him in Israeli politics down the road. It's not impossible, especially if Trump really badly want it, and Trump has shown he's capable of exerting some kind of pressure on Israel, on Bibi, and Bibi personally feels heavily constrained to oppose Trump and say no to Trump because he's got a lot riding on Trump for any reelection campaign. So yes, whether with Bibi and more likely with some new Israeli governmental configuration, is it possible? Yes, especially with a lot of American support and pushing and the rest of the world playing their appropriate role with the Palestinians and getting them to at last finally begin to fly right if that's possible at all. Yeah, in theory, it's doable and possible, and I think you know at that point, Bibi, MBS, and Trump would be primed to go and make normalization happen.
Thanks, John. Jonathan, one maybe last question we can close out quickly with you. Any thoughts on Iran using the Houthis to pressure the Saudis to back off with the U.S. and Israel relationship?
It's a good question. I think so. On the one hand, the Houthis have proven a very useful cudgel against the Saudis. The Houthis showed for years their ability using relatively rudimentary drones and also some more advanced missiles to make life hell in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a land of a lot of high value targets. Not certainly trouble defending its airspace in any way nearly as well as say Israel has. The Houthis also showed a similar capability to make life rather difficult for the U.S. Navy in the Red Sea. I think ultimately, it's understanding the Houthis' decision-making calculus and their risk acceptance has proven difficult for a lot of people. It seems for now at least that the Houthis, they've got their own sort of de facto ceasefire with the Saudis for a long time. They've now got one with Israel since the Gaza ceasefire. I would ultimately look to Tehran here. Tehran's decision-making calculus about certain things has profoundly been affected by Israel and U.S. effectiveness in the 12-day war in June, particularly in the nuclear program. I think Iran's decision-making calculus about the rest of its ability to threaten the region, its missile programs, its air defenses to protect itself, and also its ring of fire, to surround the region. I think we're seeing Iran certainly try to rebuild that network and to prepare, basically undo the verdict of the last 2 years, and to prepare to have at least the ability to credibly launch those threats again. And the Houthis, sort of out-survived every other proxy in the network. Hezbollah was always supposed to be the crown jewel, and look what happened there. So yeah, I think Iran certainly has not given up its general mind frame, which is it's always best to push, sort of push our ability to threaten our enemies as far away from our own borders as possible. And the Houthis have certainly shown a willingness and even an ability to do that to greater extent than the other proxies that Iran, frankly, spent more time and effort building and designing over the years.
Hey, Blaze, just I know you want to end. One point that's important for the audience to know that I just read about was that whatever civil nuclear deal has now been reached with the Saudis explicitly does not include enrichment and reprocessing capability inside of the kingdom, which is incredibly important, is
Mhm.
a change from what MBS was insisting on up until, and this is how crucial that 12-day war was. That 12-day war in June set back significantly for a few years the Iranian nuclear program, and the United States government landed on a position. It's the gold standard. It's longstanding non-proliferation position of zero enrichment for Iran, therefore taking away any kind of the argument the Saudis had for if you're giving Iran enrichment under the JCPOA, you've got to give us enrichment. 12-day war and the Trump administration's strong position finally on zero enrichment has kind of shut that down. And that's incredibly important. And that's an important success for United States and Israeli policy, frankly.
Well, thanks, John, and that's a perfect segue. For those of you who are interested, please join us tomorrow at 4 p.m. for a webinar where we're releasing our latest report, which is an assessment of and lessons learned from Operation Rising Lion and the 12-day war, where we'll get into all of that much more deeply. But in the meantime, John, Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us today. Thank you to everyone who joined in. And we'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you so much. Have a
Great.
good night.
Thanks,
Thank
Blaze.
you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks.